This is the Screaming Pods Network on screamingpods.com.
And now, on with the program.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls.
We interrupt this program to give you a bulletin just received from one of our naval units at sea.
Hello, what have we here?
My God, it's full of stars.
Xenopod from the year 5000.
Welcome to Xenopod from the year 5000. I am your host, Sean DeRager. I am very excited about today's episode. I was going to kind of do an episode where we talk about the Maze Runner Trilogy. I was going to get a guest on, and we were just going to kind of, talk about the films, what we thought about them. But then at my co-host of the Screamcast, at his kind of elbowing, Brad Henderson, he said, hey, man, why don't you reach out to the director, Wes Ball? And so I did. And Wes Ball, the director of the Maze Runner Trilogy, was kind enough to let me interview him for today's episode. So we're going to get to that in just a little bit. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about these films. There's 3 films in the film series, the film adaptations of Maze Runner. There's Maze Runner, then there's Maze Runner, The Scorch Trials, and then there is Maze Runner, The Death Cure. And all 3 of these are out on Blu-ray right now. And as we get into it in the interview, I was a little kind of apprehensive to give these a shot because we're in this kind of young adult, post-apocalyptic overload with where we were at the time with films like The Hunger Games. But I gave these a shot and absolutely loved Maze Runner. The Scorch Trials was even better. And then I had a really fun time with The Death Cure, kind of finishing out the trilogy with these characters, with this journey they're on. So I highly recommend it. And I know that my co-host for the Screamcast, Brad Henderson, he also loves these too. He kind of turned me on to these. So yeah, we were going to have this whole episode where him and I were just going to talk about these films, but it turned into just me talking to Wes Ball about these films for about an hour. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into that.
Day one, Greenie. Rise and shine.
What is this place?
Can you tell me your name?
I can't remember anything.
Who put us here? We don't know.
What's out there? The maze. Every morning when those doors open, the runners look for a way out. No one has ever survived a night in the maze. What happens to them? We don't belong here. I think it's time we find out what we're really up against.
Everything started changing the moment you showed up.
It's a girl.
Thomas.
Why are we different?
What if we were sent here for a reason?
You're not like the others. You're curious. But if you want to stay here, I need to know that you're going to follow the rules.
Well, with me today is the director of the Maze Runner films. There's 3 films right now. I'm calling it the Maze Runner Trilogy. We'll get into that later if there's going to be any more.
I like that. Hello, everybody.
Wes Ball joins me today on Xenopod from the year 5000. Wes, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, man.
I'm kind of a new convert to these films because...
Oh, that's cool. That's actually a cool story. I'm anxious to hear that, actually.
Maze Runner came out in 2014, and it really hasn't been too far. I mean, this is 4 years ago, which isn't really that long.
Yeah, it was, September of 2014 was the first one.
But when it came out, there's a lot of the young adult novels kind of coming out and everything. And I had kind of already was hitting kind of like Hunger Games fatigue, you know, it's just like, oh man, another one of these. And it wasn't until my co-host for the Screamcast, Brad Henderson, brought it up a couple years back that he really enjoyed Maze Runner. And I was like, well, I better check this thing out. And so I found it in Target, and I grabbed the Blu-ray, and I immediately sat down to watch it, and I absolutely I loved it. I love the idea. I love the idea of these young kids. I guess kids. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Young adults kind of thrown into this situation. There's a sci-fi element. There's also this kind of what's that? I'm having a brain blank on the movie with the kids on the island.
Lord of the Flies.
I should know this. Yes, Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
Feel, and I loved that aspect to it. So I really enjoyed the first film, and just had a lot of fun with it. And then when I heard that they were going to keep going, because I was totally divorced from the books. I had no idea about the books. Sure. I didn't read the books. And then, Scorched Trials came out, and then I caught that once it hit Blu-ray, and I catch a lot when things hit Blu-ray just because of, kids and everything. It's just hard to make it out, make it out to the theater. And then just recently, The Death Cure came out on Blu-ray, and I finally caught that. And as a whole, man, I love what the journey these characters have taken. I love that each of the films, and I'm sure it's this way with the book, but each of the films they all kind of stand on their own in a way. Yeah. Each one has a kind of a set main location. Yeah,
it's its own little universe that just keeps kind of expanding.
Right. There's an expansion, and then there's an expansion with the characters, and you kind of go along and you really start getting invested in these characters. So, yeah, I mean, and I'm telling everyone now, like, you need to check these movies out. They're not what you guys think they are.
I get it. The whole, we've always kind of been the sort of disowned stepchild thing of Hunger Games. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, it's one of those. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's interesting when I meet a lot of people who hadn't kind of checked it out at first, and then happen to go check it out, and then come to find it's not quite what they thought it was. Mm-hmm. Maybe for better or worse. But that's always kind of for me a cool experience for people that you kind of play against their what they're expecting. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I want to get into the films a little further, but what I don't want to do, I guess, really is spoil each of the main things of the film.
Yeah,
so I want to tread lightly around the main, I guess, plot points or things that can be considered spoilers. Because I feel like my whole goal with this podcast is to try to get people to check out movies they maybe wouldn't check out.
To any of the big spoilers.
Yeah. But the first thing I wanted to ask you, kind of with these films being in the science fiction genre, and these kind of being these are your first feature length films, which I want to talk about in a little bit as well. Did you gravitate towards science fiction when you were growing up? And then if so, what were the films that kind of had the biggest impact on you?
Well, one of the first ones for me, the first rated R movie I ever saw. I imagine we're probably close to the same age, but it was Terminator 2.
Yes.
That was my first rate. It was a big impact for me because I remember my dad taking me. We were on vacation actually, and my dad took me inside and said, "We're gonna go watch the Terminator movie. It's rated R. Are you okay with that?" And I'm like, yeah. I think it was 91, so I was like 11 or something. You know what I mean? So it was a big deal just for that, like a step forward, into adulthood. But then for that to be the movie that kind of brought me into the adult world of movies, perfect, So that kind of set me off, along with my friends, down this path of like Aliens, and Alien, and of course there's Star Wars, but I actually consider Star Wars more fantasy than sci-fi. But all those movies in the 80s and 90s, that was my era. You know what I mean? That's where I kind of came out and really fell in love with movies. You know what I mean? Especially movie making.
Yeah. What is it that you love most about science fiction? I kind of have like my favorite genres. I, of course, have a horror movie podcast. I've always gravitated more towards science fiction. To me, I think just because with horror, I feel like there are some elements, but there's kind of a basic not soapbox, but a basic box you kind of keep the horror tropes in a little bit. And then the science fiction, I feel like you can kind of expand more. and you can bring in horror.
I would say
you can
that for
bring in
me,
comedy.
the best horror is actually the ones that fit into some other genre.
Yeah.
Right. You got Alien, right, which is a horror movie set in a sci-fi world. You've got, I'm drawing a blank on all the different versions of that, but Quiet Place even today, it's kind of a sci-fi sort of thriller thing, or a monster movie at least. But I hear you. That's sci-fi. I think is always interesting because it's always that core concept that usually it's around. It's in our case, it's a kid wakes up in the giant maze and has no idea where he came from or how he got there and has to find a way out. There's always like a concept that's usually wrapped around these science fiction ideas that are fun to explore. What if, right? That's usually the fun part of sci-fi. And then you get to kind of analyze the kind of character dynamics or some kind of a social issue inside that kind of circumstance. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Twilight Zone, perfect example there too, Yeah,
I mean, I love that with science fiction. I mean, even with horror, like I guess most genre, like, George Romero did this with his films. You can bring in social commentary into this playground and kind of build your way around it. And with sci-fi, you have even more room to play because you can kind of just make stuff up. Physics don't necessarily apply. You can bring in new technologies. You can just bring in all this extra stuff.
The gravity drive, so you don't have to float around through everywhere. Like
exactly.
That.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit also kind of about your journey to these films, because you kind of hear this happening where a new director kind of gets brought in and gets given, a decent budget to do, kind of a possible tentpole film. Yeah. But not many directors can say that they've helmed, what I would consider a successful trilogy of films. Because you came out and you did Maze Runners, your first feature-length film, and of course Scorched Trials, and then now The Death Cure. So I mean, I really think that's awesome and a really cool part of your story as a director. Moving on from here, what was your journey up to that point?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I always knew I was going to be work in the movies somehow, right? I kind of fell in love with the movie making pretty early on. So I went to film school, Florida State Film School, learned kind of live action filmmaking, and shot on film. I was like the last class actually shot and cut film. So at least I have that experience. I don't need to go back to that personally, but it was fun to have that kind of discipline. It was in film school that I decided I was going to do my first animation, my first kind of animated short. And that was kind of at the time kind of crazy because the school had never done animation. We're a live action school, but I was kind of up in my dorm room, essentially, tinkering away on the computer, trying to figure out how to do this little short that I made. It was called A Work in Progress. And it's very Disney. It's very sweet and almost saccharine, It's interesting because at the time for me, I had been watching a ton of student films and they all were kind of about the same thing. It was like, an assassin, or it was about someone coming out of the closet, or what I mean. It was always particular topics that people were interested in when they were making these little college student films. But I decided I was going to make something totally different that fit more into the Pixar mold, And then so I ended up winning a student Oscar off of that, which is crazy. It's just nuts. As soon as I graduated, I came out to Los Angeles right when I was getting all these kind of awards from these things. From this short, meeting a lot of people. I kind of talk about the bottled water tour, of LA, where you kind of meet these different producers and executives and these people. And like, so kid, what you got? And I just, being totally naive, thought, hey, I'm gonna be a director now. Do you just give me a movie now? How does this work? Of course, it doesn't work that way, right? So it became, I kind of sold one little thing. It was one little thing that I did. It was called The Treehouse. It was kind of this dark fantasy kind of like horror thing with kids, which looking back has a lot of like resonance with, or at least it echoes kind of the Maze Runner themes in a weird way. But that was my kind of first process into kind of this development hell of like, it didn't go anywhere. It just kind of unraveled and fell apart in my hands. I was like a 22, 23-year-old kid. I didn't know what I was doing. And so that kind of all fell away. All my chances, all my opportunities were gone. It kind of evaporated. But fortunately, I had this animation background, right? So I started up this little kind of visual effects company, pretty much by accident, where I called myself Oddball Animation, and no one really knew it was just me, for the most part. And I would bring on some friends here and there for freelance work, but I'd always presented, Oddball Animation is calling, so I'd present myself as a company. So I started doing lots of visual effects and, commercials and music videos and all this crazy stuff. That's how I paid the bills, you know what I mean? And so, and after that, I got to this place where I just I have to make something, I have to do something for myself. I was tired of doing client work type stuff. And so, I decided I had this little idea rolling in my head for a long while. And it was this kind of post-apocalyptic, although I wouldn't call it post-apocalyptic, but it was this kind of big, kind of large, almost epic fantasy thing. But it happened to be set in a world that was 1,000 years after some catastrophic event happened on the planet. And I had this little opening that was very much in the vein of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was just kind of an introduction to a character and a world and kind of a concept. And so it's centered around this guy and a bike chase through the streets of an overgrown civilization. And that became the short that I put out called Ruin. And people can search online for that. It's out there. And so I made this thing for basically 8 months. It took me, I thought it was going to be 5 months, but I basically said, I'm not going to take any work. I'm just going to sit down, focus, and make this thing just so I can get it off my chest. And then maybe I can use this as a show reel piece to go work at a visual effects shop. I can go, work for Weta or something, or ILM. That was kind of a dream of mine to become a really cool visual effects artist. And, so I made this thing and I just kind of put it out online and boom, it just kind of, I got that kind of that crazy thing that happens where it just spread everywhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
On Twitter and then on Facebook and then through all the different blog sites. And it became just, this kind of crazy feeding frenzy in a weird way where all those people that I had met, 10 years previously were knocking again and asking, hey, what you doing these days? And so, but this time I was, maybe a little bit smarter, I suppose. And I had a kind of a story behind this thing to back it up. And, I would go in and pitch this stuff along with my buddy T.S. Nolan, who's a screenwriter. He was a working writer actually at the time. And he and I would go around and pitch this thing to lots of great people that I still know to this day. I mean, I remember J.J. Abrams was the first person who actually caught this short and brought me over, and it was a big day when you got a call from him and saying, "Hey, why don't you come out to set tomorrow?" Because he happened to be shooting in Los Angeles, and I wound up on the Star Trek set while they're shooting a scene there, and I was like, it was awesome. It was like, whoa, crap! It was a big IMAX camera. Holy, that's amazing! Yeah. So it became this really fun little time, And so all these people, all these different little companies and studios and stuff, were asking, "Hey, can you tell me the full story?" And I kept playing coy, I'm not ready to give you the full story yet, but there's a big story behind it. Just give me a couple weeks. And during all that time, during that kind of that weird kind of flirtation that happens, right? That time, I was meeting some people at Fox, and I had told them I had made this short on my computer screen, but I had actually designed it and made my kind of camera choices for a giant big screen, and I made it in stereoscopic 3D. So I had never actually seen it in stereoscopic 3D, right, with 3D glasses. I had only kind of done the cheap version, the red and blue version, where that's how I would judge the stereoscopic settings that you can kind of do that kind of version of the movie. And one of the executives there, his name is Steve Asbell, is a great friend of mine now. He basically said, "Dude, you got to come to the lot and we'll just give me the file and we'll put it up in our theater here on the lot and we'll just go sit down and watch it." I'm like, sweet, that sounds fantastic. And so Steve kind of invited some producers and just different people on the lot out there to that little thing. It was just a little tiny room. I've been to after this, I've been to that theater a lot to screen our movies and our dailies and stuff. But it was this cool little experience, played it up, played great, sounded great, all this great stuff. And it was after that screening that another executive there kind of pulled me aside. And she had something in her jacket. Her name was Daria Sursek, and she gave me this book. It was called The Maze Runner, and she says, take this home and read it and tell me what you would do with it. And so here I am talking to them about all these people about the movie version of Ruin and all this crazy stuff, and then I got this other thing, this Maze Runner book. Okay, interesting. So So I went home and read it, and I said, "Oh, interesting. This is kind of cool. This is kind of Lord of the Flies." And for me, when I was growing up in Florida, I grew up in a really small town. It was a great way to grow up, but I spent most of my childhood out in the woods, building fortresses and fighting monsters, and that was my childhood essentially. And so
I was very much the same way. I was in Iowa, so
okay, exactly right. So very
wintertime
similar,
we had
sure.
Hoth.
Right, exactly. I didn't get snow, so all I had was like muddy, muggy mosquitoes and whatever swampland. But so the Maze Runner story kind of really connected with me on that level. I love this kind of like little survival thing. In fact, I actually changed a little bit from the book for me to kind of push more into that idea of survival. And so anyway, I kind of they had a script and a director previously attached to this thing, and it just wasn't working for whatever reason. And so I read the book first, and then I read their script, and I kind of immediately said, "Oh, I would do this totally different." And so it's totally naive in hindsight, but I came in basically with a little bit of artwork that I made, and basically a pitch for a movie that meant throwing out their script and starting over.
Wow, that's pretty ambitious, man.
Totally. But the thing I had going for me was this short ruin that I had made.
Yeah, right.
A lot of the textures in it are concrete and overgrown plants, which is exactly the aesthetic of Maze Runner. So I used a lot of those same assets to make some of these images that for me kind of felt like the Maze Runner world. Yeah. I did a couple of them, and they didn't all wind up in the movie or anything, but they definitely kind of presented an aesthetic. You know what I mean? And so based on that in the pitch and all this kind of stuff, I went in and met with the studio head and kind of pitched my version, and it was right there in the room. She said, "Great, you're a director. Let's get started." So that was kind of that story. Now, I've told this story before, so if anyone has heard it, forgive me, but it's a crazy story. What happened was that was on a Monday, and then Tuesday comes around, and I'm like flying high. Like, oh my gosh, I have a shot to make a movie now. I might be a director. This is amazing. So Tuesday I get a call saying, "Look, we want you to make this movie, and we want you to be a director, but we're not going to make any choices yet because we have you on the books to finally come in tomorrow and pitch your feature version of Ruin, finally." So I go back into Fox like a day later, and me and TS, we TS Nolan, Tom Scott Nolan is the writer. I keep saying TS, but we pitched our version of Ruin to Steve Asbell, and Asbell says, "Great, I love it. Let's buy it. Let's do it." So that week was like
wow.
It was like lightning struck multiple times. I probably used up all my luck that I have in my life, and I was given this chance to basically work for Fox. And so we got busy making Maze Runner. That was really important to them, and Ruin kind of put on the shelf, and I said maybe I'll come back to it after the first movie, after I finish this one. Got to work kind of making those scripts and those stories work, and I thought for me at the time I was just going to make this one movie and then move on. That was it. I liked the first book. I wasn't totally thrilled with the second two. At least I didn't see how I would do my version at least. So that was the plan, and then we just went off to the races, and the whole idea was that Fox wanted to make this movie because it's a gamble, right? One, it's a gamble just on a property because these books, they had sold maybe like 5 or 6 million copies, which is not bad at all, but it's not Hunger Games, which had sold 60 million copies or whatever, right? So we weren't even in the same league really in terms of awareness. But so that meant essentially that there's a cost threshold that they would be willing to spend. Yeah. And so it started out as like a $20 million movie. And when they started seeing some of the artwork I was generating and some of like the visual type stuff, that kind of got expanded slowly as we went along the process. And it ended up being a $34 million movie, which is, in a studio world, that's basically romantic comedy money, not a sci-fi, a franchise starter. You know what I mean? But because of my background in visual effects and all that stuff, I had a few tricks up my sleeve and some good people around me to help kind of realize, basically a fantasy kind of like suspense thriller, sci-fi kind of concept with these movies, and do them for a price, and then ultimately, what's kind of cool is these 3 movies combined cost, $160 million, maybe. That's the price of, most single movies that come out, and now we've brought in just shy of $1 billion in box office. So, very proud of all that. It's been a hell of a ride, but we'll see what's next. But it's been an incredible opportunity, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, that's awesome. The budget to me, like when I started looking at the budgets for these and everything, and just how they look on screen. I mean, unfortunately, I wasn't able to see these on the big screen. I'm kind of kicking myself.
Yeah, it's a cool experience. We spent a lot of time on that big screen experience. But one day, maybe it'll get re-released.
Well, I mean, I definitely, if I have the chance, I'm definitely going to jump at it. But what I love about these films is that you can tell that there was attention to detail with the effects, and me being, the movie buff that I am, I'm a huge practical effects, and being a child of the 80s and then the 90s, huge on practical effects. And I feel like once movies jumped into digital, they were very much hit or miss, especially when you get around to science fiction or fantasy.
Sure.
Kind of rewatching some of those is a little bit painful that came out in like the later 90s. Once Jurassic Park hit, all of a sudden everyone's like, we're going digital.
Right. Yeah, totally.
With some varying degrees of visual trickery. Because not everyone's a Steven Spielberg.
That's right. No one is.
But what I loved about these and is just how they looked and how the effects I think hold up, especially with a movie of this budget. So through these 3 films, how important were practical effects versus digital? How did you handle that? Because I know a lot of I feel like, I could be wrong. I'm just kind of audience member looking in at the industry, but I feel like, because of cost and cutting corners and everything, that there's a lot of, we'll fix it in post, we'll get the visual effect in, or we'll do it digital.
Yeah.
How was that arm wrestling for you?
This is actually a huge, this could be a huge conversation, but
that's fine. I just poured another scotch. So however,
all right, drink up, guys.
Cool,
let's go. So I'm very aware of the whole, it's practical, man. That's the way to do it. That's the way, that's the way the movies we grew up on. The truth is, practical doesn't really work anymore. A lot of these movies that everyone just thinks about, they did that practically. Most of it gets replaced by CG anyway.
Right.
But what that tells you, the reason what people don't like is bad VFX, right? Yeah. That's the stuff that's it's when it's used, is when it's not used properly. And usually what that comes down to, especially say, after Steven Spielberg or James Cameron, those guys, they know how to use the tool. And it's just a tool. It's not a crutch, right? So there's a whole kind of method of how you use visual effects and how you shoot visual effects so that they work great. Because usually what happens is, you've got, say, a director who doesn't really know the tools, has a guy next to him saying, yeah, sure, we'll make it work, yeah. And you've got some poor visual effects guy who, a supervisor who, clock's ticking, money's on the line, and he just has to say yes, and they'll figure it out. But there's a natural thing with which I try to kind of, actively, try to make sure it doesn't happen. But, when directors have this kind of air of importance around them for some reason, and people are afraid to tell them, yes, no, this is going to not work. This is going to be terrible. And pretty quickly, I try to, whenever the team comes in, and granted, I've worked with the same team now pretty much for the last 3 movies. So it's easier conversations, but I tell them guys, it's okay. You can tell me. I don't have any ego. I don't need to be right. Just tell me what's going to work. And so also that along those lines on the VFX side of things, I knew enough to be dangerous. I wasn't the greatest artist ever, but I knew how you could shoot things, and I knew the pitfalls of, what would make for a great shot and what would make for a bad shot. And so too often what happens is it becomes an afterthought. You don't understand the tool that you're using, the visual effects tool, the computer later on, and you shoot things in a way that doesn't matter how great of an artist or how realistic your model is or whatever, the framing's off or the lighting's off or whatever it is, right? It's the pieces that need to come back together as you shoot them in different kind of times and spots. They don't line back up. And so that's usually what you're picking up on. It's a fix it in post, just like what you said. It's usually about people that, there's no time, there's no money, and there's not enough forethought and planning to make this stuff work really well. Now, what that means for me in these movies usually is I don't get the benefit of, we'll reshoot that later, or, we'll throw big money at the problem or whatever it is. I usually have to, have pretty severe constraints on us, right? So in the first movie in general, there's like a sequence when like there's a kind of attack on their village essentially. And I could afford the creature in that sequence. I could afford about 8 shots, right? So going into that sequence, I had to plan, okay, I can show this thing 8 times. Those 8 times better count. You know what I mean?
Nice, yeah.
And so you end up kind of designing a shot that really features it, that really kind of like, okay, we're gonna make this feel real. It's gonna be handheld. The camera's gonna be moving. We gotta put some tracker markers up. We'll make that work good, but we need some interaction. So we'll have some lights set up there so that we can see this thing. You know what I mean? So it's all about that. It's about how you use that tool to work, because if it's done properly, you get brilliant stuff. I mean, you talked about Jurassic Park, and to me, that thing is so amazing to this day. Granted, hey, shaders and some of the different kind of rendering kind of techniques we have today are light years more advanced than Jurassic Park, but those shots still hold up today, sometimes better than what I see in today's, dinosaur movies. You know what I mean? And it's because how they shoot it.
Yeah,
he shot it like he was shooting a movie, right?
Yeah, he knew how to blend. He knew. The thing about those films, especially around then, like I feel like they knew when would be a practical effect and when would be a digital effect, and when they'd be able to marry the two and be able to composite out, and switch out things. Like you said, like there was a plan going in, and that way you can really composite some really good shots, and that's what I feel is missing from a lot of studio films. I mean, even if you look at Justice League, I mean, that movie had so much money thrown at it, and there's so many bad special effects in it,
right?
That I'm like, if they would have taken the and I know that one that movie especially had some problems because Zack Snyder had to leave due to some family issues, and then Joss Whedon came in and wanted to put his little stamp. I mean, there's things going on there,
right?
But it's so important to have that plan coming in that I feel like a lot of these movies sometimes don't. And
well, I'll tell you what also happens with these giant movies. Usually you are, which I didn't experience on the first movie, but I did experience on the second and third movie. You have a release date before you even have a script.
Yeah.
Right. So you are racing. You are, the only thing you can do is you can't invent more time. All you can do is throw more money at the problem. Right. So I'm sympathetic somewhat to what those kinds of movies have to deal with. It's difficult, environment to be in. But usually that's usually the product of lots of different teams that aren't really communicating well with each other, or last minute changes, or there's a mustache on a guy and we have to get rid of it. It's that kind of stuff that you're right. It hurts the movie experience. And what happens to me, these movies sometimes they just feel like product. They don't feel like real works of some kind of a creative endeavor. You know what I mean? They're just like, we gotta get this out. And that's a shame.
Yeah. Well, the one thing about these 3 films, especially that I notice, the first one you have the maze, trying to get out of the maze. The second one is more of a post-apocalyptic, almost a zombie film in a way, post-apocalyptic kind of action film with zombies. Third one, more of a
heist movie.
Yeah, cityscape heist movie, and I love how each of them transition. You said you weren't a fan of the second and third book as much.
Well, I wasn't. I didn't see my way in, I guess.
Right. So how? So what direction did you take? I guess adapting these, in particular, kind of choosing like, all right, I'm going to keep this aspect, and I'm going to change this, and then of course, once you change something in the first movie, you have to keep that through. If it's a character change or kind of a world building change, you have to keep that through to the other movies as well. So what were the kind of I guess, biggest challenges kind of going through and making these books, like essentially like you're making them your own, which is what I think every directing and writing team should do with an adapted work.
Yeah. It's it is the challenge, honestly. It's probably the most work that we did as the, me and TS, the writer, my producers, Joe and Wick, that is where most of our, creative energy was spent, is taking those books. And the truth is, those book fans, they are passionate about these books, like in a serious way. Right. And I appreciate that. And I want to do right by them, because I feel like they're the ones who really, launched our franchise, our first movie, right? They're the ones who kind of, went out and evangelized these stories to people and said, no, it's not like Hunger Games. You should really check it out. You know what I mean? It's that kind of stuff. So they're very, very important to me. So I don't want to like just throw the books away and do my own thing. So usually what it's about, like for me in the first movie as an example, and I want to be careful about spoilers here, but, I'll say this. I'll say right up front. I'll say this: that the movies are very close in spirit to all the books. What happens in those books basically happens in the movie, but I might get there in a different way. What I always kind of explained to people was like, I'm working with the same ingredients, but I might have come up with a different recipe, right? So usually for me, I see in the second movie where you're talking about the zombie kind of trope thing, where in the second book, what we find out is that after that first book is that at the very end of that book, you step into a completely new world, right? And that world was a cool one. It's a post-apocalyptic kind of world, and it's filled with these crazy virus-infected people, right? And so I knew that was, at its core, the kind of movie it had to be, right? So then it was about, okay, we have to take all these kind of dramatic character things that are also happening in these stories and make sure that they work, right? There's a particular, betrayal, for instance. Mm-hmm. We were going to make sure that betrayal really worked. And not only that, but set us up. Right, exactly. But not only that, but that it set us up really well for the third movie. Because when we were editing the first movie, that's when, I thought, again, I was going to go away and do something else. Yeah. The studio kind of came to me and said, hey, it's fine if you want to go do something else. That's cool. We'll support you. But you should really think about, doing the second one. Don't twist my arm, but, think about doing it. And so I went away and I read it and I kind of tried to figure out what is my way into this thing. Okay, it's kind of a journey movie. And I kind of like the idea that these characters, they're out of the maze, but they're still lost, right? And they're trying to still find out who they are as people, which will make sense when you watch the movie. But that was kind of a way I kind of locked into it. And then on top of that, like you said, what was kind of exciting to me is that I didn't have to go back into another maze. I personally couldn't do that. I don't think. Right. Just do the same thing over and over again. Most of the time,
a sequel is going to do that. I was expecting to end up in a maze at some point again, and we didn't, and that was so refreshing.
And we get knocked for that too, by the way. How many people if only I would have just followed the normal kind of formula of any of these, whatever these movies that we've seen, where the end is you go back to the same place you started, and you have an even bigger battle. With more bad guys, and it's like I wasn't interested in that, to be totally honest. Like I want to do something a little different. I liked the idea that these little movies were actually character movies.
Yes.
If you don't connect with these characters, then the movies aren't going to work for you. Basically, there's some cool spectacle, there's some cool fun and adventure, but if you don't connect to these guys, then you don't care what happens to them. Because I always love that these movies, they're a little bit more intimate. They're a little bit more like a garage band, franchise, which is cool. It's like we're a little more dirty and a little bit more, raw, essentially. And I personally really like that. But so, yeah, I guess without, again, talking about too much particulars, it was really fun that each movie got to be kind of its own thing. And that was, for me, what Star Wars was, right?
Yes.
I mean,
exactly.
Looking at Empire Strikes Back, of course I was looking at that when I was making the second one. It's like, oh yeah, all those different worlds you got to visit, and so when we were making that second one, we found some incredible locations, right, to go to, and I tried to really up my game in terms of execution, so I typically can't go back and rewatch my movies, I just have a tough time with it because I just keep like, oh, I should have done that, or I wish I changed this, or
every artist is like that.
If only I had known the choice we made on the first one, I wouldn't have made that choice so that I could not have to deal with it in this one, you know, because, you know, the books are, they're a really tricky mythology. They're very, not necessarily a bad way, but a convoluted one. And it works on the page, right? Books, you know, you have a way of filling in the blanks because you're using so much of your imagination anyway, right? When you're reading a book. But in movie terms, you are a passenger, right? To something that's happening up there on the screen that you know, hopefully invest in, right? So it's show, don't tell, you know, and that's been the trickiest part, is how do we still get across the basic concepts of these books, but do it in a way that works in a movie world, versus what I kind of feared, if I were just to do what was exactly in the books, it'd be really laughable. You know what I mean? Things like in the first book, you know, they have telepathic abilities, the characters, right?
Gotcha.
These characters,
right.
when they wake up, they can actually talk to each other through their minds. And I knew right away, there was no way I'm putting that in the movie.
Yeah, telepathic powers are always, even in movies where it kind of works, it's always very tough.
The only movie that ever worked, ever worked in my mind was Lord of the Rings.
Yes. Well, yeah.
You know, when you see, I forgot her name, that you know, Cate Blanchett's character.
Yeah, is that Galadriel?
Yeah, and they have that great little community shot, Frodo of the Shire.
But it makes sense with her, though.
Yeah, but it was like great. It worked so well because it was like a really interesting, kind of majestic kind of moment for this character and her powers and stuff. But anyway, it doesn't even really work for me in Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. Luke, you know, Leia, hear me. I mean, it's you know, it's a little silly. It worked for me as a kid, but today I don't think we would go with it. I don't think. But anyway, so
it's always the same effect. It's you got a lot of echo and
exactly right. It's like, and I was not interested in doing that. And then second to that, another kind of change, and it comes from my interpretation of the books essentially, was I felt like because the concepts were fairly, I don't want to say ludicrous, but they were very far-fetched. It's a gigantic maze that's filled with monsters and changes every night. That's a little out there. You have to either go with it or it doesn't really work for you. So my approach was essentially, I'm going to make this really grounded and real, right? I'm going to treat it as if it's real. It's not going to be a kind of a cartoony kind of like, you know, kids thing, right? And so that meant things like in the book, the mazes are actually all underground and the sky is all virtual. It's all digital kind of thing. And for me, that was just too far. That was one step too far for this kind of very grounded, real world. So it's things like that where my changes came from, where it's like I would leave things out and try my hardest to not contradict the books, while maybe at the same time sort of having my own sort of spin on how we arrived at particular kind of really dramatic beats that were important to the story's functioning as a whole, right? So that was, and who knows, maybe I did it all wrong. Maybe someone else would come in and do it better, but we did the best we could.
It'll be a remake in 10 years. No, but that's what I always love about like adaptations of books though. And I always appreciate it when a filmmaker and a writer, or sometimes it's a filmmaker / writer, sometimes they're doing it all on their own. But they come in and they interpret it kind of their own way, and a very, I don't know, meaningful but an original way, but they make it their own. And for me, I feel like that's speaks a lot more to me as a film goer than somebody just kind of ticking off every little note of the book. Because what I like to do as a viewer is I like to be able to enjoy each thing on its own. So a lot of times I'll read a book first and I want to kind of go in and enjoy the film. I mean, you look at one of the biggest examples of this was the Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, where Stephen King hated the film version, but The Shining is fantastic.
2001 also, right?
Exactly, yeah. So that type of adaptation I always love. I mean, the only time I ever saw something that really worked beat for beat was Zack Snyder's Watchmen. I feel like when he did that with a graphic novel, and then even 300, like that worked, but that was already a visual medium.
Yeah, totally.
but a novel is a whole different ballgame.
It's a very, very different ballgame, right?
And even with J.R.R. Tolkien's books, the Lord of the Rings had, like, Peter Jackson had to make a lot of changes to make this into a film, and I feel like most of those worked. But you can't kind of like be married to the page if you enjoy a book or a certain property. I feel like it's always fun if it's done well. And then, like, for me, I'm coming in, like I said, completely. I haven't read the books at all, and I kind of see what you're doing with these films. I'm invested in the characters most of all, and I'm kind of going through on this journey, and that for me was really rewarding. So
what's kind of interesting is for someone who is maybe just now, say, visiting the movies, for them to watch them all in close succession to each other is going to be an interesting experience, actually. That, because, say, the second movie, I chose to basically be exactly like 5 minutes after the end of the last one, right? And that's going to be interesting for people that might choose to kind of check these out today, to have them that close together. And I'm not sure if it will work or not, because for me myself, like I said, I can't really go back and watch, but I would imagine that there's definite growth as just a filmmaker for me personally, in terms of craft. As you move through each movie, they probably each get better and better made,
Oh man, yeah, I definitely noticed that. Well, that and Thomas Brody Sanger, like, ages like 5 years every movie.
Yeah,
like,
totally. Yeah, you're right.
Him just grow, in these films is great. Even Will Poulter,
totally agree.
But seeing them, I love that. I mean, you see that with like the Harry Potter movies and stuff like that, and
but they were lucky because they had a year gap, right? Or they had a summer gap, whatever, before the next school year or whatever. So they always had a little bit of a pad in there. But yeah, it is interesting. It's a tricky challenge.
Well, Will especially is like, he went from like this, I mean, his eyebrows are always villainous.
Yeah, they're iconic, man.
But he went from like this scrawny young guy to like this, beefcake of a guy, and by the time you get to the third film,
totally, yeah. That was the school of hard knocks, man. That wasn't age. That was that was the mileage that they went through.
With his character, it makes sense,
right? Yeah.
So
there's a perfect example right there for it, But like that was in the books, and we knew we had to do that, which I won't give away, but that we had to figure out how to get that back in there. So by the end of the third one, what we're doing is we're juggling, 12 different characters and all these kind of threads we got to tie up, and it's just it was a real challenge. But
how did casting come into play? Because Dylan O'Brien plays our lead, and I really see him kind of developing into this action star. I really loved seeing his growth through the films, and even when you get into the second film, the addition of Rosa Salazar as Brenda is just her character is fantastic. I really love seeing her there. And then even like Barry Pepper comes into play,
Giancarlo,
oh gosh,
Aiden,
yes, and then we have bigger actors and actresses here that I'm having a brain blank right now.
Patricia Clarkson, Kaya Scodelario, Lily Taylor, lots of great people.
Walton Goggins makes an appearance in the third. Oh my God, once he appeared.
Walton is like freaking awesome. He's like in fact, everyone, man, it's like, I've been so lucky with like the casting here. They've just been like great people to work with, just down to earth. We're going in every day and we're just playing, having fun. It's just fantastic. And, it was a good experience. And, Dylan in particular, he was the last person we cast, in that first movie. That was a big deal, is to cast our Thomas, our guy that's going to be, the Thomas of the books. And that was a tricky choice to make, but I think we made the right one. And you're right, Dylan is not just an action star, he's extremely physical, which oddly enough, I never really tested that with him for some reason. I don't know why, but he's made a joke once before. It's like, I never asked him to run, and he does so much running in these movies. What if he looked ridiculous? It was the whole way to have done.
Right. Watch these Tom Cruise movies, you'll get it. Just do what he does.
Right. And the guy runs great. I mean, he's got a great look when he runs, But anyway, I was more focused on the character side of things, like who was this person, And I had seen his Teen Wolf stuff, which is a very kind of jokey, fun kind of character, which is totally opposite to what Thomas is as a character. And we made the right choice, because I think what especially you see by the end of these movies is like he's not just an action star. He's a great, actor, period. He can handle drama just as well as anyone. And in fact, I think they're all fantastic actors. And I can only hope that in the future that these are all going to be like just if not famous, they're going to be well known as, oh, that guy, who shows up in everything, or that girl who I always see them and they always do good stuff. You know what I mean? Because they take their craft really seriously, and they have the chops to kind of back it up, So I think we lucked out in that way, that we got to kind of almost discover this cast,
Were you heavily involved in the casting process with most of these? Okay.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And I have some credit goes to Denise Chamian, my casting director, who I met office early on in the first one, and she and I would just talk constantly, and how about this guy? How about this person? How about this? Ooh, I think this. And we just, I would take I would learn a lot from her and how to deal with actors. I'd never dealt with actors before, you know what I mean? So that was a whole experience, But man, it's been really cool. It's been really fun. And of course, they're all great friends, and we always kind of. I just saw a movie with Dylan the other day, and it's good times.
Yeah. So like when we first started talking, when I was asking you to come on here and for me to to interview you about this. And like you're almost kind of wary a little bit about the negative response, a little bit,
which we get plenty of.
which and it happens. I mean, even like the biggest, best movies have their critics.
Well, I'll be honest though. I think unfairly for us in our case, which is I think is interesting to hear your perspective on it, because you had yourself preconceptions before you even saw the movie, and I think there's an element to that with our movies that, hey, if you watch it, you don't like it, fine. But, the idea of that we're somehow trying to, pull a fast one on an audience or something, that we're not taking it seriously, or, whatever, like that always has bothered me a little bit. And when I see the kinds of movies that get complete freaking passes and I think they're garbage, I mean, they're actually literally terrible movies, and then we get, kind of knocked on it, it does hurt. It stings a little bit. But, as a director and being now with these for 3 movies, you develop a thick skin. So, you let it roll off. But
it goes along with the job, I guess.
I said my part.
But that's the thing about these 3 films, man, is I couldn't come in and say that these are poorly made films. Like, I really, really enjoyed myself with these films. And the Death Curse starts out cracking, man, with a train, right? They're trying to break some prisoners out. That scene, even if you don't like anything else in the films, you have to admit that scene is fantastic. There's tension. The effects look great.
It's a 12-minute action scene.
Oh man, there's a rawness to it that's just great. And a lot of the times, like my daughter's 12, and we're going to start watching these. She's I was like, hey, I'm talking to the director of these movies.
She's probably in a good age to actually watch them. Yeah.
Oh yeah, she's developing into like just a movie freak. So it's a lot of fun. She's always asking me, what are we going to watch next? What I like about the films is that it doesn't play down to the potential audience.
Yeah, that's right.
What I mean?
Yeah.
It takes these things seriously. Serious stuff happens in the film. Everything's kept to a PG-13 level, I guess, but I mean, it's not.
It's on the edge, yeah.
It's not like catering to it. Like you get.
Yeah,
the
I mean,
point
we are
across.
almost R. In fact, the last 2 movies, we were R for a couple cuts.
Okay,
and it took a lot to try to get down to that PG-13. But it's not because of blood; it's because it's really intense. Like I said, I went for that really kind of grounded approach, so it makes it feel a little bit more real than other PG-13s that can get away with blood flying all over the place. We can't even get away with a drop of blood. You know what I mean? So it's interesting, and like you said, it's like our core audience for those books and just who the people who go see these movies are. It's the 14-year-old girls for the most part, But I didn't make it just for them,
Well, that's why it's like there's not that predictable love story that most executives would be like, hey, we got to get this 14-year-old girls, or it's
right.
You need to have that. It didn't cater to that stuff. Like you're surprised. There's elements of romance and love and all these emotions, but it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't go where you would expect it to go, and I think I really appreciated that.
Yeah, we try. We try to change it up and not do the expected. But at the same time, we are tied to sort of. There's certain things that need to happen. You know what I mean? That we know have to happen, and that's always been kind of the fun in a weird way because the challenge is okay. We know we have to go there. How do we get there in an interesting way? You know what I mean? So that can be a good thing versus when you're starting over from scratch and you have nothing to go on. You can't blame anyone else.
Well, I mean, I really hope more people. I mean, I really like. For the most part, everyone that I talk to that I've said, hey, I'm watching Maze Runner movies, everyone is like, oh, yeah, I'm surprised they loved it. Like, as far as my circle.
There's a lot of great kind of support. If nothing else, people kind of respect, I think, the effort put into it. Usually the criticisms are like source material, which I don't think is really fair, but it's fine. It really is cool. You can like it or not. It's all good. We did our best, and we're all really proud of what we did, and had a great time making these things. And hopefully, at least we know that there's at least a fairly sizable number of people out there, just based on ticket sales, that did go to see these movies, several times. So that's
just
cool.
Based
that's
on
exciting.
my Twitter feed when I contacted you about this interview, it was nuts.
Oh, was it? That's awesome.
So what's next for you? Do you have any upcoming movies you're possibly looking into? Is there anything you can talk about? Was the Death Cure, was that a cap on this trilogy?
For me, yes.
For you, okay. So
yeah,
what's
I'm
going
done.
on?
I'm done with these movies.
What is next for you that you can possibly talk about, even if it's being vague?
Yeah, there's definitely
is Ruin gonna have its feature
film?
Well,
it's funny. I feel so bad too because after the first one, it's like I'm gonna make Ruin. Oh no, I gotta make the second one. I'm gonna make it. No, I'm gonna make a third one. And it's like this poor Ruin just keeps sitting there on the shelf collecting dust. But one day, But
the rights have been bought, right? The rights are there.
Yeah. Fox owns the rights, and they keep renewing them. So it's owned at Fox, which is cool. And it might one day be something I come back to, and I need to kind of reinvent that one, to be honest, because I've stolen a lot from it for these past three movies, honestly.
Right.
Because there's an element of Ruin that was a little bit of a Western, and that opening train thing was almost from Ruin, because I want to do a Western kind of opening, except without horses. That's where that train sequence kind of came from. But yeah, there's a couple things that I'm working on. And there's one in particular that was been reported on, is this Mouse Guard thing, and it's a comic by David Peterson at Boom Comics, and it's really cool. It's basically an epic fantasy, like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, but it's with mice with swords.
Nice.
And I'm doing it with Matt Reeves, who's the director of Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
And
man.
So we're gonna do it a very real mocap movie, similar to how, say, Avatar or Planet of the Apes or those kinds of movies basically were made. Really pushing the envelope on the kind of technological aspects of it, but doing something that's very, take it very seriously, but at the same time have a ton of fun, because I'm in this place right now where I've just made these three movies that, are about the end of the world, and about the stakes are like, life and death, and it's heavy stuff, man. It's drama, and I'm really interested in doing something that's really fun and adventurous now, and what better to do, basically, fighting badass mice, in a fantasy world that we've never seen before. It's kind of exciting. So we're kind of working on that right now, developing that. And I'm kind of doing tests every day, doing a lot of really cool stuff with game engines and just where that whole kind of technological world is going right now. It's actually fantastic. So yeah, I'm looking at some stuff right now as we speak. So there's that. Then there's there's this Fall of Gods thing I've been working on, which is it's basically it's this great kind of graphic novel that these guys did, Mood, and it's called Fall of Gods, and it's basically a Norse mythology Western. So if I were to pitch it, it'd basically be The Revenant, but with Norse mythology.
Nice.
It's totally freaking cool. But it's hard R, you know what I mean? And I'm not sure I want to go there yet, but
right.
You know, there's that, and there's a couple other things here and there that, you know, some TV things and whatever. So, you know, it's kind of interesting. It's like for the last 5 years, I have been, you know, in this very fortunate, you know, position to like be, here's your next movie, and now I'm kind of in this place where it's like, you know, I'm done with these movies. I made 1, 2, 3, beginning, middle, end. It's great. It's fun. You know, I'm happy for it. But now it's a new world in front of me, and I can kind of go anywhere, and I don't know, you know, where I'm gonna end up. So it's kind of exciting. You know what I mean?
That's awesome. And I've friends who've worked in Hollywood and stuff like that, and that's kind of the thing. I had an acquaintance who did a lot of visual effects or sound design. In many movies, like he did Terminator. His company did like Terminator Salvation, and then some other films, and that was the thing. Once for their crew, like once that film ends, it's like, all right, well, what are we doing next? You know, and there's always that kind of valley that they go through. It's
an interesting world, is the movie business. One, it's very small, right? Everyone kind of does know everyone in a weird way, and you're like a traveling circus. you usually, especially for like movie makers. We rarely ever make a movie in Hollywood. You know, we always go to, you know, some tax incentive place around the world. Like the first movie we shot in Louisiana, and then the second movie we shot in, you know, New Mexico, which was fantastic. And then the last one we shot in Cape Town, South Africa. You know, so for 8 months out of the year, I'm away from my family, you know, living in a remote world, which is a fun adventure, along with this kind of, you know, crew and cast of crazies, you know, and we kind of roam the world making these movies together. And then, like you said, it's like, you know, when that's done, you have to look for another job. You know, it's like, you know, someone made an interesting comment. These movies, when we put them together, you know, you're basically building a Fortune 500 company, you know, in a span of a couple months. And then in about a year and a half or two, you dissolve it and start over. You know,
right?
That's kind of our life. It's interesting, you know. But man, I wouldn't trade it for anything, because it is like, you know, it's you know, when you're sitting around and talking about how big the bombs you're going to put and how big this building's going to blow up, and then you get to push the button, you know, and it's like, oh man, it's like you're a kid in the candy store. It's like, it's fantastic. You know?
Can't complain.
No, absolutely not.
Well, Wes Ball, thank you so much for talking with me about these films.
Yeah, man. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, and I can't wait to see what you're gonna do next. The next things you have, in the incubation stage, I guess, sound fantastic. But in the meantime, everybody, please make sure you check out Maze Runner, Scorch Trials, and Death Cure. I'm going to be rewatching these again with my daughter. I'm really excited to kind of see her reaction.
Yeah, tell me how that goes
to these films. And like I said, if you slept on these, I pretty much state my reputation on that. I can put my reputation on the line. It's not much of a reputation, but I mean, whatever I have, I can put on the line, saying that these are definitely worth checking out. If you're a fan of science fiction, you definitely would get your money's worth here in checking these out. Wes Ball, again, thank you for joining me, and thank you for being so generous with your time.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
I want to thank all of you for listening to today's episode. Please like and subscribe us over on iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher. Your reviews and ratings really do help the show a lot. So you can find those links over at screamingpods.com. You can find our little icon there, Xenopod from the year 5000, designed by Derek Hefner, who also designed the Screaming Pods logo. So very excited about the artwork that he's brought to the table with all this. And please check out his work. Also check out all the other fantastic shows on the Screaming Pods network. We've really brought together a really cool, just a nice combination of interesting shows with passionate hosts talking about things that really they enjoy, and hopefully you guys dig hearing them too. You can also subscribe to the master feed of Screaming Pod so you can hear everything as they come through. Also, if you like these shows, these other shows, please like and subscribe to them as well. There's also a donate button. You can donate to any of these shows, to their Patreons or things like that. But your support for these shows really does help keep them going, and even just giving them a shout out on social media, it really does help us narcissistic podcast hosts get through the day once we launch these episodes into the world. So we really wouldn't be doing these podcasts without you guys listening. So I really do thank you. Speaking of these shows, Tom Nix, who was on last episode of the Xenopod, his podcast has launched. It's called Wrestling is Everything. His first episode is up, and it is fantastic. If you dig kind of storytelling podcasts, this is for you. It is not necessarily about wrestling. He has created this really cool show where, it deals with wrestling, but it is not necessarily for people who really care about wrestling. He talks about the 1950s and civil rights with a wrestler by the name of Spudnik Monroe, and he had got arrested because he went and hung out with his fans in what was called at the time a Negro Cafe. A very, very well done, eye-opening, and inspiring episode right out of the gate. So that's Tom Nix and his podcast, Wrestling is Everything. Please check it out. Hit me up on Twitter, Xenopod5000. Let me know what you thought of the show. I will talk to all of you next time. We will be talking Stuart Gordon's Space Truckers. Talk to you then.